Thank you all so much for coming to this, our fourth now event in the Harlow Summer Seminar Series. I am really pleased to have so many folks here, especially on a hot day. Thank you for bearing with us. If at any point you get overly toasty in this room, in the meeting room back there, we still are streaming the presentation and the audio. So if you want to be able to be cooler and have more space, you can always go into that room as well. I wanted to quickly highlight some of the other events that we have going on this summer, including one that's actually happening in 2 days. So this is a full day outreach day, a Saturday event, which we haven't done in a long time, and we're really excited about. This is Wild Bird Day, and it's going to be an entire day of sort of bird research themed activities and talks. So it begins at 8 a.m. in the morning with some guided birding talks, or sorry, guided birding walks. So you can go out with University of Wyoming graduate students and sort of get some bird ID in this part of Wyoming. And then from 10 to 2 p.m., we'll be having crafts and activities for all ages. So that includes sort of crafts that will appeal to younger kids, but also stuff like demonstrations of research methods and stuff that would also appeal to adults. We'll also have from 12 to 2 barbecue lunch, like we had barbecue dinner tonight. So if you want another burger or hot dog, we're always here for you. And then also on, and then at the end of the day, when everyone's getting tired, we'll move in here again in the toasty room, I'm sorry, but for really cool research talks by a lot of folks that are really knowledgeable on birds. So if you are at all bird interested and would like to come and join us on Saturday, we would love to have you. Also then next week in this time slot on our normal Thursday seminar series, we're following up sort of a theme of historic talks that we're going to begin this week with a talk about historic photography in the American West, and really excited about that. And I think it'll have some overlap with the talk that we're going to have today. So hopefully if you enjoyed today, then you'll maybe want to come join us next week. Oh, and then I also want to point out details of any of our events are always available at our website, which is uw-nps.org. And you can also join our mailing list, and then you get emails from me like 2 or 3 times a week. I'm very sorry. And there are sign-up sheets for our mailing list that are in the meeting room, and I think there might be one outside as well. And then finally, I want to introduce our speaker for today. We are so lucky to have Dr. Maura Jane Farrelly with us. Maura is the Associate Professor and Chair of American Studies at Brandeis University. She's also the author of 3 books, the most recent of which she's going to tell us about today. And Dr. Farrelly is an old hand at the AMK, has come up here while doing research at the station, and we're really lucky to have somebody who's coming back to report on the work that they've done that started here and has gone away to complete. So that's always fun for us. I think also, as shown by the number of folks that are here tonight, there's a strong fascination with the history of this particular piece of land and these buildings. And so I'm really eager, and I know lots of you are really eager to sort of hear more of this story and all of the sort of cool tidbits that were dug up. So without further ado, I am gonna step away and let Maura take over. Just for the folks on Zoom, please stay muted, and if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible, both from Zoom and from our in-person folks.
First, I would like to begin, Hillary, thank you so much. Bonnie, you are apparently watching on Zoom. Bonnie Robinson, who works for the center here. Michael Dillon, who was the former director. He was directing this place in 2018 when I first came out to Jackson to start doing research. I am so grateful to all of you. I am really happy to be here talking about this. I have some friends down from Bozeman who know that for the last 6 years, I've been talking about almost nothing but the Sargents and the Hamiltons. So it's nice to have some fresh ears because they're sick of hearing about, although they did come down to support me. I'd also like to say that this is a book that has a cast of characters. There are hundreds of people in this book. It is centered on 3 main people, whom I'm going to talk about. But then there are 2 very important supporting characters, 2 little girls who are both named Catherine, one spelled with a C and one spelled with a K. And I've been able to track down their descendants, and I've interviewed them. And one of these Catherines, Catherine Beatrice Hamilton, her grandson is from Nebraska, and he is up here as well. And so I want to say to Kent Hamilton Seacrest, thank you so much for being here. It was a really nice surprise to look up and see him. So what I'm going to do, Holly mentioned that I've written 3 books. Y'all don't want to read those other 2 books, trust me. I've never gone out and done talks about those other than at boring academic conferences. I understand that what authors who do this sort of thing are supposed to do is that they begin with a reading from the book. And so I'm going to read a little bit from the prologue. I initially thought I would read the whole prologue to you, and I timed it out, and even I was starting to bore myself. So I'm just going to read some parts that tell you a little bit about how I found this story, because I know she's kind of famous for many of you. All knew her. I didn't know who she was. I'll be able to mention the AMK Ranch a little bit, although I don't mention it by name. I'll tell you about why it's called Compliments of Hamilton and Sargent, and then we'll take it from there. And I'm going to, I found my second pair of readers. Yes, I do this. This is how bad I was. All right. So, and I have pictures that go along with it. I'm going to put my water here. Also, I should tell you, I apologize. I am chewing bubble gum, which my grandmother, whom you are about to hear about, would be appalled at. But I have this weird disorder where I don't make saliva, so I have to chew gum while I'm talking. So I apologize for that. All right. I wrote this book because of a photograph my mother found in her parents' house after my grandmother died. A lone woman in silhouette stands outside a rough-hewn log cabin, playing a violin in the shadow of the Teton Mountains. A Victrola is situated in the grass in front of her, suggesting the music she's creating is not without accompaniment. Her hair is piled on top of her head. She wears a loose Garibaldi blouse, popularized in the 1860s by the leader of the Italian Unification movement, and a slim, high-waisted skirt known as a rainy daisy that debuted in the 1890s. It had a higher than usual hemline so that active women could wear it while hiking or playing tennis and not have to worry about tripping over themselves or having the skirt get wet. On the back of the photograph in her tight script, my grandmother had written the name Edith Sargent. Curious about who this woman was, I did what all good scholars do. I hopped on Google. After narrowing my search, combining Edith's name with words like violin and Wyoming, I finally discovered a letter to the editor in the online archives of the New York Times. It was written in August 1913 by a woman named Edith Sargent, who took great exception to the way the Times had covered the death of her husband. According to the newspaper, John Dudley Sargent had been a recluse. He killed himself earlier that summer in the valley between the Gros Ventre and Teton Mountains, known then as Jackson's Hole. I am here to state as a loyal, loving wife that the man was incapable of committing murder, Edith angrily told the newspaper's editor. He was never unbalanced except by melancholia, which does not prompt people to murder their chums. In its coverage of John Dudley Sargent's death, the Times had resurrected rumors about his relationship with a man named Robert Ray Hamilton. The stories to which Mrs. Sargent objects originated among ranchers in Jackson's Hole, who did not like Sargent and Hamilton. The paper explained in an effort to give Edith's letter some context. The stories had to do with the death of Hamilton and the first wife of Sargent. They were to the effect that Sargent knew more about Hamilton's death in October 1890 than was ever brought out by official investigators. The Times reminded its readers that Robert Ray Hamilton had been a state lawmaker from the Murray Hill district of Manhattan before he died. He was the son of General Schuyler Hamilton of this city, it noted, meaning he was the great-grandson of Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Treasury Secretary. Ray Hamilton had also been the central figure in a scandal in 1889, the Times recalled, in which a woman by the name of Ava Mann and a purchased baby figured. Thus began my journey down the rabbit hole and into the den of other people's secrets that became the setting for this book. The secrets I uncovered soon involved more than just murder, suicide, baby selling, and a founding father's family. They also involved bigamy, blackmail, debt, rape, incest, guillotining, corpse skinning, child abuse, mental illness, and not to be outdone by any of that, elk poaching. Suffice to say, there were days when I found myself wondering whether this story was one I had any right to pursue and tell. The older I get, the more comfortable I become with the reality that people are complicated and that the most interesting people often have secrets. Lives that are characterized to a greater or lesser degree by mystery or deliberate obfuscation. I practice saying that word out loud. Teaching and writing about history has also helped me come to terms with this truth. Historians will rarely admit it, but archival research is often voyeuristic. Almost all of us go into an archive hoping to find something we were never meant to see, something that was meant for some other set of eyes and is available to us now only because the person who created it or for whom it is intended is no longer alive to protect it from the prying eyes of others. This book is a story about the secrets that shaped the lives of three Americans in the late 19th century: Robert Ray Hamilton, John Dudley Sargent, and Edith Drake Sargent. Exposed secrets are usually humiliating, and humiliation is what drove Ray, Jack, and Edith, independently from one another, to leave their lives in the eastern United States and settle in Wyoming, a wild and isolated region along the last remnants of America's frontier. Ray hoped to free himself from a messy marriage that had attracted quite a bit of press attention in New York City. Jack was tired of being passed around by wealthy family members in New England who were more interested in business and philanthropy than they were in raising him. And Edith went west after a reporter for the Boston Globe discovered she'd had a romantic relationship with an infamous criminal in Paris who generated headlines all over the world. Aha, you did not know that. You all know that picture.
I don't know that.
Great. Okay. When they settled in Wyoming, Ray, Jack, and Edith were doing what generations of Americans before them had done, starting with those Puritans who left England in 1630 and founded the city of Boston, where I am from, along the shores of Massachusetts Bay. They were moving west to what they believed to be an unsettled and uncivilized part of the world, because they hoped that doing so would make it possible for the humiliations and persecutions of their old lives to be forgotten. In the case of Ray, Jack, and Edith, however, the strategy did not work. They were not forgotten, not in their own time, and to some extent, not even in ours. Robert Ray Hamilton, I put it up here early because I wanted you to have a chance to read it. Robert Ray Hamilton is memorialized on a plaque at Riverside Drive and 76th Street in Manhattan that reduces his life and career to the scandal over his marriage. Jack is the subject of a folk opera called Marymere, which was showcased at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in January 2020, shortly before all live performances were shut down because of COVID-19. Just about any travel guide to Grand Teton National Park will tell you that Signal Mountain within the park was named for the signal fire set by the search party that found Ray Hamilton's body in the Snake River in 1890. And a historical marker, which you all walked by to get here, right? A historical marker on what used to be John Dudley Sargent's homestead, now a biological research center in the middle of Grand Teton National Park, calls Jack, right down here, the undesirable offspring of a prominent East Coast family, the same family that produced the portrait painter John Singer Sargent. It also echoes the newspaper coverage Edith found so objectionable when it informs visitors Jack was, quote, suspected of murdering his first wife and his partner Hamilton. Meanwhile, Edith herself is a bit of a cult figure in Jackson Hole. I had no idea who she was when my mother showed me her picture, but many longtime residents of Jackson, Wyoming would have recognized her instantly. The Chamber of Commerce there has used her image to promote tourism in the region. That is almost certainly the disappointingly mundane reason my grandmother had the photograph on the cover of this book in her possession. Edith Sargent is a character in a musical titled Petticoat Rules, which has been staged several times over the last 20 years by the Off the Square Theater Company in Jackson. And graduate students working at the Biological Research Station on what used to be Jack Sargent's homestead, have a tradition of grabbing bear spray and heading out into the woods to find Edith's violin tree, a now dead white bark pine that Edith is said to have climbed, sometimes naked, during the years she lived on the homestead so that she could privately play her violin and gobble peanuts, according to one particularly amusing version of the story. So skip ahead. There's history in the prologue about the railroads and the transcontinental telegraph and the closing of the frontier. In 1891, on the back of a photograph of the Tetons taken from his lodge along Jackson Lake, John Dudley Sargent wrote the words, "Compliments of Hamilton and Sargent." It was a phrase you'd often find on postcards in the late 19th century. Business owners looking to advertise their products and services would have it printed onto cards that featured attractive images, a colorful tulip or morning glory, perhaps, or a cute little girl in a meadow picking flowers, or a little boy getting his Christmas tree, or a rather unattractive baseball player. The cards were designed to be collected, the idea being that the image had been provided to the card collector by the business. Compliments of Reynolds Brothers fine shoes, for example, or compliments of C.S. Price druggist. The lodge where the photograph was taken was something Ray and Jack had built together. Their intention had been to host wealthy vacationers from the East Coast, people who were willing to pay good money to awake to the same view Jack awoke to almost every summer morning for 23 years. Today, the Grand Teton Lodge Company charges visitors as much as $600 a night to have that morning view, suggesting that Ray and Jack were not wrong to think they might be able to make money off the grandeur of the Tetons half a century before America's 5th most visited national park was created. Jack planned on turning the photograph into postcards, which he would then use to market his ranch to people in Boston and New York who he knew would recognize his last name and that of his deceased friend, who had not been forgotten. More so than railroads, telegraphs, the closing of the American frontier, or baby selling, corpse skinning, bigamy, incest, and elk poaching, this story is about people, their eccentricities, their naivete, their loneliness, their corruptibility, their eagerness to find or assume the worst in one another, and their longing for peace, beauty, anonymity, nobility, and love. I bring it to you, compliments of Hamilton and Sargent. So, and I can tell you, I found this down at the American Heritage Center in Laramie, probably on day 3 of my research. I had come out here not knowing if I was even going to find a scholarly paper, let alone a book, and spent all my own money. I was going to be out here for 2 weeks, hotels, rental car. It was not a cheap trip. I spent my entire first day reading about nothing but elk poaching. I was so depressed. I went to the Safeway in Laramie and got a big bottle of wine that was called Elk Cove, drank the whole thing that night. Went in the next day and kind of hit the jackpot and knew that I had more than just a scholarly paper. I had a book. I just had no idea how I was going to organize it. And after I was there for a week, I drove up to Lander to do some hiking, and I remember driving on that road between Laramie and Lander, and I was thinking about this postcard, and I was like, that's it. That's the title. I had to change the subtitle a little bit for academic reasons, but that's the title. All right, so I know that unlike Casper and Laramie, where I talked before, I met Holly and Laurel. There are people in this room who know a lot about this story already. And I said in the abstract that I was going to tell you a little bit about my discoveries, but I'm not going to tell you everything. The reality is I'm not going to tell you most things, all right? Because I realized this project, more so than the other 2 books I wrote, that this project was going to have storytelling as a big component of what my responsibility was. Those other 2 books are academic books. And so I make an argument, I genuflect to the historians who came before me, I offer some evidence, and then I throw those historians under the bus. That's the way it works in my industry. That's not what this is. I worked very hard, and I'm not naturally a storyteller, so it was a bit of a stretch for me, but I worked very hard to think about when I was going to reveal certain parts of the story and why I was going to reveal those parts when I did. Because I wanted as much as possible to replicate the process of discovery for my readers. I had to visit archives all over the country. Sometimes it was because, I found a letter in the Millward Simpson papers down in Laramie that recalled, there was a lawyer, it wasn't Millward Simpson, it was another lawyer in the Jackson area that recalled taking depositions for attorneys in New York City when John Dudley Sargent sued Joseph Pulitzer and James Gordon Bennett Jr. for libel. And so this attorney in Jackson, whose note was in the Millward Simpson papers, remembers being the attorney who took those depositions. So then I had to find those depositions, which meant I had to go back east, down to New York City, into Surrogate's courthouse there, which looked like it was straight out of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And I will tell you what I found in these depositions. I was staying with a friend in New Jersey. It was February, and I got on the train and went out to New Jersey, and my car was covered in snow, and I started crying. And it wasn't because I had to dig my car out. It's because of what I found in those depositions. And so I don't think I'm necessarily going to make y'all cry in the book because I'm just not that fantastic a writer. But if I can replicate some of the shock and some of the disturbance that I felt for you, yay, then I've done my job. So I am not going to tell you what was in those depositions, except it's a big deal. And it has to do with something that happened here in 1897. I will tell you this much, though, because you deserve to know this, all right? John Dudley Sargent did not kill Robert Ray Hamilton. He didn't. I know a lot of people think that. That's a part of the lore. He did not. I have two sources, one of which is John Dudley Sargent himself, but I have an independent source that verifies he was actually in Idaho when Robert Ray Hamilton drowned in the Snake River. The other thing is I can pretty much pinpoint when it is that the discussion started linking Jack Sargent to the death of Ray Hamilton, and it was in 1897, and the person who was responsible for it is a man named Will Simpson, who was an attorney in Jackson. He ended up writing a newspaper article that was published down in Evanston, and this is the first time. It's what is this, 9 years after Ray, 7 years after Ray has died. This is the first time there is any suggestion that Jack had anything to do with Robert Ray Hamilton's death. And now you can fast forward. It's a good job, Will Simpson. You put that out there, and we're into the third decade of the 21st century, and you can Google Jack Sargent, and you're still going to find websites that talk about how he murdered Robert Ray Hamilton. I will tell you, he did not murder his wife, Adelaide, either. I know some of you are familiar with that. I say that this does not mean that he did not play a role in Addie's death, but I am not comfortable using the word murder to describe that role. I'm going to go back to these people so we can look at them again. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him because he is not as well known. I mean, but you don't know a whole lot about him as Alexander Hamilton's great grandson. I have at the beginning of the book some family trees. Oh, and in fact, you know what? Let me fast forward. I'm going to give you a chance, a very short chance to see if you can figure out one of the bombshells in the book on your own. Hillary was able to figure it out. These family trees are right at the very beginning of the book. They are there because I talk a lot about different family members in both the Hamilton family and the Sargent family, and I know it can get a little confusing. And so this bombshell, I really didn't want to reveal it until later in the book, but it's right there in the family tree. If anybody is, oh, that's Ava. That's the wife, Ava Mann, the story of which a purchased baby figure. All right, so here's Jack Sargent's family. Descendant of Catherine Winthrop Sargent and Eve Sargent. We go down all the way. I'll just let you look at that for a few seconds. Dum 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 dum. Da, 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 da. You don't get as long as Jeopardy people. You're gonna have to read the book if you didn't, but Hillary got it. Hillary got it in the right amount of time. Let's go back to our three people. So chapter 1 is pretty heavy on Hamiltons, and I'm going to ask you just to have patience with me and to use that family tree that is at the beginning. I don't talk exhaustively about all of the Hamiltons, but the Hamilton family was a little bit like the Kennedy family today. Prominent, wealthy, known for their involvement in politics, completely riddled with scandal from one generation to the next, scandals that people like us eat up. All right, so if you've seen the musical, you know that Alexander Hamilton had an affair, that it, became a big political issue. It was deeply embarrassing to his wife. What you may not know, but what I do talk about in chapter 1 is that between Alex and Ray, there was quite a bit of scandal in those two generations in between. And I felt it was really important for me to let my readers know how scandal-laden this family was, because the reaction that Ray's family had to his scandal, the one in which a purchased baby figured, and I can give this one away, it's not all that surprising, got his girlfriend pregnant, did the honorable thing, married her, surprise, surprise, it's not his baby. Surprise, surprise, it's not her baby, it's a baby that she bought, right? And so this all comes out. Oh, it's actually the fourth baby that she bought, but again, you got to read the book. This all comes out when Ava Mann stabs the baby's wet nurse and is, has to go on trial. So all of this comes out. Yes, it's pretty scandalous. But given the scandals that were in the family before he's doing the right thing. He married her, right? He didn't know. The reaction of the family has always struck me as being over the top. They were extraordinarily humiliated by this scandal. And I think by the end of the book, I offer up a pretty good explanation. The truth is, I think there was a lot more going on in this scandal than is readily apparent. Even in looking at some of the historical records, I had to do some real detective work, which I do not mind bragging about. I'm pretty proud of myself, but you got to get to the end, right? But in order for you to appreciate this, you have to get through all those Hamiltons in chapter 1. So that's Ray. Jack, so again, he's a sergeant. He's the same family as John Singer Sargent, although John Singer Sargent is descended from each Sargent's first wife's marriage, and the marriage to his first wife, and then Jack is descended from the marriage to Catherine Winthrop Sargent. That name, Catherine Winthrop Sargent, that was his great-great-grandmother. It is also the name of one of his daughters. He was very into his family's heritage, and he did a lot of genealogical work, some of which I was able to find here in Jackson at the Jackson Historical Society. He was a Boston Brahmin. The Sargent family was just one old Boston family that he could stake a claim to. Dudley, that's a very common name in New England as well. This is actually my old life as a historian who works on American Catholic history. One of his ancestors, Paul Dudley, was Chief Justice of the Superior Court in Massachusetts, and he left a gift to Harvard in 1751, which is the oldest endowed lecture series that Harvard has. It's done at the Divinity School. It's on religion. And the mandates of the lecture series are very particular. Year 1 has to be on this topic. Year 2, this topic. Year 3, this topic. And then year 4 has to be on the whore of Babylon and the heresies and usurpations and damnable untruths that the Catholic Church has put out there. So it's this it's nowadays Harvard's Divinity School, they're like, how do we handle this? You're really not supposed to break the mandates of an endowed lecture series. So they reserve that 4th lecture for discussion on how important Christian ecumenism is. And nobody from the family has stepped forward to complain about it. But the Dudleys are a big family. As I said, he was a descendant of Catherine Winthrop Sargent, who was the great-granddaughter of John Winthrop, who was one of the first governors of Massachusetts. He's the guy who delivered that famous speech on the Arabella that said, "We shall be a city upon a hill, a model for all of Christendom." So again, he's got a lot of heritage on his father's side of the family. On his mother's side of the family, I get into her family in chapter 2. She was a Hemingway. And in New England, the Hemingway name is pretty well known. It's not so well known outside New England. It was only starting to become well known in the Gilded Age, in the period that followed the Civil War, because Jack's grandfather, William Hemingway, and his great uncle, Augustus Hemingway, were timber barons. They were multi-millionaires. This is the period when cultural and political power in the United States that used to be associated with coming from these old families that could trace their roots to the colonial period, that power base is shifting to people who have money. So it does not matter that you are the son of a man who sells patent medicines and trades in horses in upstate New York. Your name is John Davison Rockefeller and you're super rich and you have a lot of money. Or it doesn't matter that you're a dirty immigrant like Andrew Carnegie, you're super rich and you have a lot of money. And so that means that you have a lot of power. Well, Augustus Hemingway and William Hemingway are some of these very first robber barons. And their wealth eventually is eclipsed by people like Carnegie and Rockefeller. But when Jack Sargent's uncle Gus died in 1876, his estate was worth $35 million, which adjusted for inflation is about $840 million today. And I would like to remind you that this is a period when there was no income tax, because we do not get the income tax until the 20th century, 1913, with the passage of the 16th Amendment. Now, the sad thing about Jack's story is that shortly before his grandfather died in 1874, his grandfather had a disagreement with his great uncle. So William and Augustus Hemingway have a disagreement. I know that the disagreement happened because I found Jack talking about it in the beginnings of a memoir that he started. I found some letters that his great uncle wrote that mentions the disagreement. They both agree that the disagreement involved $500,000, which adjusted for inflation is $11.3 million today. I was not able to find out what the disagreement was all about, although I do posit a theory and I offer, I think, some pretty good proof for what that theory was. But as a consequence, Jack does not inherit what he might have inherited were it not for this mysterious disagreement. And so in 1879, his grandfather is dead, his mother is dead, his father is out in Sacramento because his dad never really had anything to do with him. He's not the great grandson of this wealthy timber baron anymore. I'm sorry, not the grandson of this wealthy timber baron anymore. So in 1879, at the age of 17, he comes out to Wyoming. And he is too young to even be a homesteader at this point in time, because to file a homestead claim, you had to be 21. So he worked for the Union Pacific Railroad. He also worked as a cowboy. I was able to learn a little bit about his cowboy years from his grandson, who is 90 years old now and lives in Haines, Oregon. He was also regularly grub-staked, was the word that was used, by his cousin, Augustus Hemingway Jr., would regularly give Jack payments, which is how he was able to afford to have a somewhat lavish lifestyle out here, certainly more lavish than many of the pioneers were able to have in Jackson. When he died, he and his wife, his second wife, Edith, they had more than 300 books in their possession, which might not seem like such a big deal to us today, but the American West at that point in time, I mean, the writer Wallace Stenger talks about how he was so desperate for the written word when he was growing up in Saskatchewan. He used to read the newspapers that were being used as insulation in the walls of his house. So to have 300 books was a pretty big deal. These payments that he got from his cousin Gus are the reason that he had a reputation when he was out here as a remittance man, which I'm guessing some of you know the term. That sign that is down there mentions that he had a reputation as a remittance man. It was not a compliment. It was a term that was used by people not just in the American West, but in the Canadian West as well. And it described guys who had gotten themselves in trouble, usually some, maybe they got a girl pregnant, maybe they beat somebody up when they were drunk. but their wealthy families send them out west to be rehabilitated, and then they live these lavish lifestyles while they are out here. I think it was an unfair term to be applied to him, but he was getting some money from his cousin, which is why he had the reputation for being a remittance man. And then Edith, fascinating character. She studied the violin at the Paris Conservatory. Her father was a man named James Monroe Drake, who was a bonds trader. He specialized in railroad stock. He apprenticed with a man named Jacob Little, who was the very first person in the United States to make a fortune by short selling. Now, anybody want to explain what short selling is? Do y'all know? It's okay. It's like one of those things I sort of knew, but I had to look it up too, just to make sure I was understanding it properly. It's gambling. That's all it is. You know, basically, you go to a broker and you borrow somebody else's stock. And you agree that you're going to return that stock to the broker by a certain date. And then you turn around and you sell the stock. And if the value of the stock has dropped between the time when you sold it and the time when you have to buy it back, because you have to return it to the broker so that the broker can return it to the owner. If the value has dropped, you've made money. But if the value has gone up, you've lost money. And so short sellers really kind of like get happy when companies fail. They love to see stocks dropping, right? So they're not really well liked even by Wall Street folks, which are not exactly the best people, you know, exactly, right? They're not known always for their best character. So anyway, that's how her dad made all his money. He was one of the people who was responsible for something called the Panic of 1873, which completely screwed up the American economy because, again, he's gambling with these stocks, but he made a lot of money off of it. He was one of the first people to have a cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, you know, one of these big mansions that they called a cottage. He sent Edith and her sister Stella to Europe to be educated. So again, she studied the violin at the Paris Conservatory. She was thought by her teachers to be extraordinarily talented. She came back to the United States in 1887 and immediately started acting strange. And, you know, I cannot say that she was mentally ill. I know that her family thought that she was mentally ill. They did have her institutionalized a number of different times. She was also a very bright, very imaginative, very talented, very strong woman who did not conform to the social standards of the day. I mean, her father was a very prominent man in New York City. And in 1888, she submitted a joke to the New York Evening World's Midsummer Jokers column. And it involves a Boston girl who falls asleep in a streetcar, and a man slips his hand into her muff. And she wakes up and she says, "Sir, I give you 20 minutes to take your hand out of my mouth." And we are not reading anything into that joke at all. I mean, if people in 1888 knew exactly the play on words that was going on there. It's the New York Evening World, which is kind of a tabloid newspaper. That sort of humor was not inappropriate for 1888. But having James Monroe Drake's daughter sign her name to this joke, which she did, was completely inappropriate. She used to wander into the reading rooms in some of the classiest hotels in New York City, and these were rooms that are reserved only for men, and she would regale them with stories that were completely fake about how she'd been arrested in Lexington, Kentucky. She was kind of a weirdo. She runs away. She marries a Scottish carpenter. John Dudley Sargent was not her first husband. Becomes this big scandal. The press persecutes her over this marriage to the Scottish carpenter. The family's attorney issues a statement that says, you know, Edith used to be this lovely, wonderful daughter. And then about 5 years ago, she kind of went off the rails for no reason at all. Well, it wasn't for no reason at all. And, you know, he thinks he's putting everything to rest when he says, yes, she's married. She's not her father's problem anymore. She used to be great. Now she's her husband's problem. Well, when he says she was perfectly fine until 5 years ago, that is not putting everything to rest, right? That is just raising a new question for reporters in the Gilded Age. to try to figure out what happened 5 years ago that caused this perfectly wonderful daughter to go off the rails and start acting in ways that are inappropriate. And so the Boston Globe is the newspaper that breaks the story, and the article that they run is Edith Drake's Lovers. That's the title. And I will just leave it at that. But remember, I said when I read the prologue, you know, that she comes west because she was involved in a scandal involving an infamous criminal in Paris. Her brother and sister are the ones who sent her out here. They are trying to get her as far away from the prying eyes of the press as possible. Yes, they pay John Dudley Sargent to marry her and keep her out here. They gave him a total of about $7,000 over the course of their marriage to keep her out here. I'm not quite going to stop yet. I just would like to say a few more things, and then I'm going to open it up. And I don't know if anybody here has actually read the book. If you have and you want to ask me a question that requires me to give away a secret, that's fine. But before we get to the questions, I want to explain some things. I am not the genius who came up with this idea. A number of people who have written biographies have talked about the extent to which, when you were working on a biography, and this is a triple biography, that when you're working on a biography, sometimes you have a tendency to fall in love with the people that you're working with. And I felt that was true, which is part of the reason I was so devastated by what I found in that archive in New York City, because I've fallen in love with these people and it was pretty disturbing. But because I was falling in love with them, I was starting to feel very uncomfortable about the idea of writing this book in the first place. Because the framing that I have for the book is, again, that these people experience some sort of humiliation on the East Coast. And they come out to Wyoming because they're hoping to get away from that humiliation and maybe start their lives over again. And certainly many people before them have done that. But it's the 1890s. You know, a trip that used to take 3 months can be done in 4 days now. And the Telegraph is out here, and the Associated Press has reporters out here. And so they aren't really able to hide. And they aren't really able to leave their humiliations behind. But they do eventually die, as we all will. And even though their humiliations were not completely forgotten, which is why I pointed out that there is that historical marker on 76th Street and Riverside Drive, there is that musical called Mary Mere that has been performed, their humiliations were never completely forgotten, but when they died, they kind of were sort of forgotten. And then I come around in the early decades of the 21st century, and for the sake of my career, I'm going to resurrect all of this humiliation, right? Which seemed mean. It just seemed mean. And I know that these people are dead, but they were very much alive to me. And so there were a number of times when I thought I should walk away from this project because it was not my story to tell. But, you know, again, I'm going to come up for full professor on this book. So I needed to produce something. I put a lot of time and money into it. So then I thought, well, is there a way that I can make the story more than just prurient? Is there a way that I can do some good with the resurrecting of their stories? And so what I do is I use the baby selling and the bigamy and the corpse skinning as like a little hook to tell history. It's basically a history book. And so I told my friend Graham, I said I was going to resurrect this line. You're going to have to like history if you're going to get through this book. If you pick it up just because you like corpse skinning, you're going to be disappointed because there's a lot of history until you get to the corpse skinning. But it's accessible history. It's not academic history at all. I am telling the history of the Gilded Age, which was a period of tremendous change, really fast change in the United States. And I use the lives of these people to make that history a little bit more accessible. So that's the noble thing I'm trying to accomplish. Well, why is history noble, right? That required me to think a lot about why I do what I do and why history matters in the first place. And the conclusion I came to, and this is in the epilogue, so I am willing to kind of jump ahead a little bit to the end, is that I think history is important because it has the power to make us all a little bit more patient and a little bit more humble. Patient with one another and humble about ourselves. And I think the way history does that, it does that in two ways. Number one, it reminds us that there is pretty much only one constant about the human experience, and that constant is change, right? Almost everything changes. Every value or manner or habit or rule or standard that you have right now that is intensely important to you because it brings order to your world and value to your lives, and every standard and rule and manner and habit that you use to judge the people you interact with in life had to become what it is right now. It was not always what it is right now, which means tomorrow it may not be exactly the same thing. And I think it's important for us to think about that, especially right now. And I am as guilty of it as anybody else, lashing out when people violate the manners and habits and laws and rules and standards and values of our day. These things that are so important to us that we might be willing to destroy somebody's career or destroy somebody's life for the sake of something that is just going to change someday. The other thing that I think is really important that we learn when we study history is that we are very rarely, if ever, the first people in the world to fear the things we fear, to desire the things we desire, to hate the things we hate, and to love the things that we love. In the prologue, in some of the stuff that I skipped over, I point out, okay, she's here with a phonograph, which was sort of newfangled technology, and she's in front of, the Tetons, which are a gorgeous landscape. How many of us have taken selfies with a brand new toy or in front of a stunning landscape, right? That's what human beings do. The passions that animated Ray, Jack, and Edith are some of the same passions that animate us. The demons that haunted them, well, I hope not all of those demons are haunting you right now, but some of the demons that haunted them are haunting people in this room. And if they're not haunting people in this room, I rest assured they're haunting other people. And so I think that's also important for us to understand is that even though, there's a great phrase that was used by a British novelist that I use in the prologue where he says, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And that is completely true. And it is something that I'm constantly trying to remind my students when we're studying the past and they want to take the values of today and apply them to Thomas Jefferson, who owned human beings, that the past is a foreign country. And we need to remember that. But there are also some elements of the human experience that I think transcend time and culture. And it is also important for us to remember that. And if reading these prurient stories of Ray, Jack, and Edith can help us come to terms with that idea that everything has changed, and yet, human beings love their children just like all other human beings, well, then I have done something good with their stories and not merely use them to get a promotion at work. So, all right, I'm going to stop now and I'm going to open it up to questions.
I'll talk loud so the Zoom people can hear me.
Thank you.
There's a persistent idea, probably not amongst historians, but there's like progressive history. Things are always getting better. But whenever I hear a historian, they say similar ideas that you have in at each of your talk. That this isn't a hagiography. This is a people are people story, and it's relatable today because there isn't such a thing as the good old days. Can you speak to that with these characters?
Well, I can't make up my mind to your opening question about whether everything is always getting better. I mean, there are days when I think that yes, step forward, small step back, maybe another step back, then a really big step forward. I'm not prepared to answer that part of your question right now, but I will say that also in the epilogue and on the back of the book, I think the last line in the back of the book is, I say this is a story about the early demise of our right to be forgotten. I do present these people as early casualties of a revolution in transportation and communication technology that is now affecting all of us. And I'm seeing some gray hair in the room. I have gray hair as well, although I hope in this light it's maybe not quite as obvious. I may not be speaking to people who are quite as vulnerable to it as my students are, but at this point, it's not even my students. I mean, pretty much anybody 45 and younger is going to have stuff out there on the internet from when they were younger. You know, that they tweeted an insensitive joke, or they got involved in a bar fight. And it's out there and it's on the internet and it is forever. And maybe they have grown up a little bit and changed, because again, everything has changed. Human beings change. It's not just landscapes and it's not just standards. Human beings change. Maybe they've grown up and they've changed and they've moved on, and it's 10 years later, but somebody finds that out there on the internet and it's brand new to them and they are experiencing it for the first time. And this is what Ray, Jack, and Edith were dealing with. Ray and Edith especially. I mean, 25 years later, newspapers are still talking about Ray Hamilton and Ava Mann and that baby, you know, that was purchased. And he's dead at this point. You know, let the man lie. But no, it's constantly being resurrected. And that's similar, I think, to what's happened with the internet. And it's something certainly people who are younger than we are need to be aware of. But again, I also think it's important for all of us who are encountering these older stories on the internet to think about the idea of forgiveness. And I have a former student who's actually waitressing down in Jackson right now. She was hoping to come up to this, and I mentioned her in the book. She's the one who got me to think about this idea that when we talk about the right to be forgotten, what we're really talking about is the desire to be forgiven and the question of what forgiveness demands of all of us. And again, I think those of us who encounter these stories on the internet about other people, and there may be older stories, we need to remember that life has changed and that we are far more common. We have a lot more in common than we don't. And we need to maybe process these stories a little bit differently because they are out there. The frontier is closed. All right, so just like these people moved out here, the year that Ray moved out to Wyoming was the year that the Census Bureau announced they were no longer going to be tracking population growth in the United States in terms of westward expansion, because they said there's no territory left in the in the United States for people to move west into. So it's a point in America's history that is referred to as the closing of the frontier. And I think we're witnessing another closing of the frontier. That the internet has opened up this vast wilderness of information to exploration and settlement. And, you know, I did stuff that was in college. I wrote things for the school newspaper that I'm really glad are not out there on the internet. But you can't do that anymore. You publish an editorial in your school newspaper about some belief that you have, and 30 years later, when you don't hold that belief anymore, it's still going to be out there on the internet for somebody to describe. So the digital frontier is closed. And I think we have to start processing things a little bit differently. Yes, sir.
What happened with the bodies? Where are they buried at?
I'm sorry, what happened with the what?
Bodies, where are they buried at?
The bodies? Oh, I'm so glad you asked me that question, because that was part of he was asking where everybody is buried. So Ray, part of the humiliation of his family, he was initially buried here, and then the New York Sun creates what is called well, first of all, so his wife is in jail when he dies, and he had a pretty big estate. And since she was his wife, she was entitled to what was known as a dower right, which is 1/3 of the estate. And so his family immediately tries to get the marriage annulled, and they make the argument that, first of all, that, you know, Ray only married her because he thought the baby was his, and it's not really his, but also she's married to somebody else. Remember, I told you bigamy is a part of the story. In any event, while this trial is going on, rumors start circulating that Ray is really alive and that he lives in Australia and that he's hiding from people. And these rumors really get a lot of traction, I think, for two reasons. Number one, they sold newspapers. So newspapers editors loved these stories. But number two, his wife's lawyer had a vested interest in the idea, or she had a vested interest in getting this idea out there that he's still alive. Because if he were still alive, his estate is still legally responsible for paying all of her bills. And so the New York Sun sends a reporter out here and they dig up the body and they verify that it's the body of Robert Ray Hamilton. And Ray's family members bring him back to New York and they bury him in Greenwood Cemetery, which is a garden cemetery. It's a very, very beautiful cemetery. It's the third garden cemetery to open in the United States. Prior to the advent of garden cemeteries, we didn't even use the phrase cemetery. We talked about graveyards or burial grounds, and nobody would ever visit their dead relatives at burial grounds. But garden cemeteries start to become parks, and it starts to become a thing for you to actually go and picnic in cemeteries and visit your dead relatives. So the Hamilton family has a plot in Greenwood Cemetery, but they didn't bury Ray with the Hamiltons because this had become such a big scandal. They didn't want gawkers coming to their plot. And so they hid his bones with his mother's father's family. And there's not even a marker there. And the only reason I was able to find where they were is I went and I looked at the papers and now when you go to the computer archive at Greenwood Cemetery, it actually tells you where Ray is buried, but it wasn't before that. So yeah, I can take credit for that. So, and again, this has to do with this deep humiliation that they felt. They hid his bodies. They also, by the way, hid his personal papers. All of the Hamilton family papers are at Columbia University because that's where the Hamilton men went. His papers are hidden at the New York Historical Society, and they're not under his name. They are under the name of his maternal grandfather, whose name was Robert Ray. And this is sort of interesting, you know, like before the digital age, you would have had to know that his papers were there before you went to the New York Historical Society and brought them up. But now you can just Google Robert Ray Hamilton and the New York Historical Society's digital finding aid comes up. And I was like, bing, bing. So again, they hid his bones, they hid his personal papers. They did a lot of other stuff that showed how humiliated they were. Jack is buried here. His first wife, Addie, is buried at the cemetery. I forget what it's called, right down here in town. Do y'all remember? I found
Aspen.
no, it's down near the Snow King. Yeah, okay. So I found her grave a couple of summers ago, and just this is sort of me, the snobbish Bostonian. I was having trouble finding it, and so there was a woman in there visiting her husband, and I asked her, you know, if she knew where this particular section was, and she said, "What year did the woman die?" And I said, 1897, and she said, "Oh, that's the really old part of the cemetery." I'm from Boston, you know. I felt like the way people from England probably feel in Boston talk about 1630 is a long time ago, right? But the reason I was having trouble finding her is grass had grown up all over her placard, so I dug it out with my hands, and I'm sure grass has grown all over it again. And Edith she was cremated. She lived the longest. She died in 1947 in Manhattan, and she was cremated, and she's out in Queens. But one of the things I'd like to talk about is she kind of was forgotten when she married John Dudley Sargent. Her name changed, and so I say in the book that she probably has the patriarchy to thank for being forgotten more than the closing of the frontier, because newspapers stopped writing about her until 1989, when there was that summit that took place right here between Shevardnadze and Baker. And, you know, they're wandering around in the woods talking about the fragility of the human existence in the nuclear age, the same woods that Edith used to wander naked playing her violin. And Tim Egan from the New York Times, he was just a scrappy reporter at that point. He wasn't a columnist or a writer of history books. He was the one who was sent out here to cover it. And in his article about the summit, he quotes a poem that was written by Edith Sargent, an early pioneer from the region from New York. And so I talk in the book about how she ends up in the papers again in 1989. But, you know, it's not because she married a Scottish carpenter or because she was telling dirty jokes or anything like that. So that's where they're all buried. I love that question.
I have a Zoom question for you.
Yes.
But also quickly on that summit between Baker and Shevardnadze, there is our last year, we had a Harlow Summer Seminar Series where Hank and Harold, who are former directors, came and talked about that summit. And it's online on our YouTube channel. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go watch that from last summer.
I will go watch it.
It's a delight. This is a question from Clark Whitehorn. Have any of the descendants approached you and said they wished you hadn't told a particular story about Jack or Edith or Ray in your book?
No. Now, I don't, there are descendants out there that I don't know all of them, but I was able to interview John Dudley Sargent's grandson. So John Dudley Sargent had 5 children. The one who spent the most time with him here was Catherine Winthrop Sargent, named after that distant Puritan ancestor. She, by the way, is the person he wanted to inherit this estate. And the county officials tried to find her. They put ads in newspapers all over the country. She did not step forward. Also, he had used the property as collateral on a loan that he took with a bank down in Denver, which sort of made it questionable whether he could leave it to anybody. And so his brother-in-law, Edith's brother, who was paying him to keep Edith out here, he paid off the loan, which meant he technically became the property owner and he didn't want to have anything to do with it. And so it was finally auctioned off for back taxes. And that's how it ended up in the hands of some of the wealthy families that we know, the Berols and whatnot. But in any event, Catherine Winthrop Sargent married twice. With her first husband, he died of tuberculosis. She had 5 children with him, 3 of whom made it to adulthood. He died of tuberculosis, and then she remarried and had 2 more children, the second of whom was born when she was in her 40s, and that's Bill Fessel, who is still alive. Interestingly, he grew up and ended up working with the National Forestry Service, and when Jack was applying for his patent, the Forest Service really, really worked hard to deny him his patent. So it's sort of ironic that his grandson ends up working for the Forest Service. And then I also talk about the fact that the little girl who was purchased, she disappears entirely from the historical record after she loses a court case in 1897 when she's 10 or 11 years old. Ray left her an annuity in his will, but because the fight with his wife cost so much money, that court case was extremely expensive, there wasn't enough money left to fund the annuity. And so his executors wanted to sell some properties that he owned in Manhattan in order to fund the annuity, but the properties were jointly owned with his aunt, and she didn't want that money going to that little girl because she was neither a Ray nor a Hamilton. She was just some orphan who probably should have stayed in the orphanage. So she contests it. That little girl eventually loses the case. She's 11 years old. She drops off the radar. I had given up on the ability to find her. But again, I stayed here at the ranch a number of times when I was doing my research. And I'd get a beer and I'd go down by the lake. I don't know if we're allowed to do that, but I would. And the caretaker here, Gordon Richmond, I was like, I was telling him everything that I found in the archives. And he was always like, I didn't think he was listening. I didn't care that he wasn't listening, but he was listening. And so I don't know what year was that, in 2019 maybe? 2 people wander onto the property. It's basically closed. It's in late fall. And Gordon comes to talk to them, and they explain that they are, the husband is the descendant of this little girl and his wife. And so Gordon put me, and that's Kent, who is here with us today. So Gordon put them in touch with me. They got in touch with me, and I now know why she dropped away. She changed her name. By the way, again, my old world Catholicism, I didn't think Catholicism was going to have anything to do with this story. Well, it did. She converted to Catholicism and she changed her name. And it's a lot of times. I mean, Kent, I think you said that your family thought that, well, that's what you do when you convert. Is it's not. You don't change your name. I think the nuns who were taking care of her in the orphanage after Ray and his wife died, I think they encouraged her to change her name because she was famous as a little girl. So her name originally was Beatrice Ray Hamilton. I found letters from people all over the United States and Canada looking to adopt her because they want access to that Hamilton money. And so she changed her name. But thanks to Kent and Ann, I was able to find out the story of what happened to her. And I'm able to talk about that a little bit in the book as well.
Can you talk a little bit about, maybe everyone here knows I'm passing through, the relationship between your story and this property and this building?
Well, not this building. So the lodge that Ray and Jack built together, it was almost complete when Ray died. And actually, you know, I was very careful about how they had it built because they really didn't do the work, right? It was some Swedish carpenters from Idaho who came over and did the work. It was nearly complete on this land. It was a 10-room lodge. And Ray's father, his mother was dead by this point. So it's his father and his brother. They don't want to have anything to do with the property or the structure that is built on it. And so the Sargent family just moved into the structure and the Hamilton family never contested it. That lodge, and Jack did run it as a lodge, and he did occasionally have some well-heeled hunters who came here. George Eastman of the Eastman Kodak Company came here. I found documentation that verified that a couple of Andrew Carnegie's nephews came here. There was a wealthy family from Chicago named the Lynns, L-I-N-N was their last name. And they came here, they were in Yellowstone, and they came down, and actually Nellie Lynn, the wife, this is when Jack was living here just with Catherine Winthrop Sargent. All of his other children are back in Maine. And Nellie Lynn had a daughter who was about the same age as Catherine Winthrop Sargent, and she was uncomfortable with how shy Catherine Winthrop Sargent was, and she felt that it was because Catherine had no interactions with children. And so Nellie convinced Jack to let Nellie send Catherine away to boarding school in Ohio and in Wisconsin. But that lodge was torn down in the 1930s. And here we are getting a little bit into an area that I don't know a whole heck of a lot about, because once Jack killed himself in 1913, I was like, done. You know, I don't have to pay attention anymore. But I will also say, Jack was never able to earn the income from this hunting lodge that he and Ray were both hoping to earn, because it was so darn difficult for people to get here. There was no road down from Yellowstone National Park. And I found many letters where he is writing to George Anderson, who was the superintendent of Yellowstone. And he also writes to William Richards, who was the governor of Wyoming. He's like, come on, let's get this road built. Like, there are two possible roads. You can build a road down from Yellowstone. Also, Wyoming had just acquired the rights to the hot springs at Thermopolis. He's like, let's build a road from Thermopolis. It'll go straight by my place and up into Yellowstone. But there was no road built within easy distance of this property until 1918, which is 5 years after he died.
Thank you. And then is this, in this picture, is that building?
This is the building that was torn down.
That it was sitting right here.
Well, not right here, but
But
somewhere on this property.
Okay.
Now, the other thing that you should be aware of is that that lake is 39 feet higher now than it was when they were here, because the dam had not been built. The first dam was built in 1907. And he did lose some of his property to the reclamation project. So, you know, but I think Michael Dillon told me the actual, like, I tried to find it. I went out there with bear spray and I found the violin tree. And I don't know if I'm gonna get myself in trouble here. But so I found that tree. And of course I had to figure out why she bothered to climb it to play her violin. So I climbed it. And I had some almonds with me. I didn't have peanuts, right? But I did not strip down naked. So I climbed it, and I was like, oh, this is why she chose to play her violin here, right? So I think the original lodge was a little bit back that way, but I'm not sure.
There is some info on our website, UW-NPS.org, about the sort of history post this period, and it's patchwork because people have chosen to focus on different sort of time periods, but there are some cool stories from that period of time. Yeah,
I'm devastated that the original lodge no longer exists. Very sad. Yes, in the back.
There's some suggestion that Sargent had some insider knowledge before he filed his homestead patent on this property. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Insider knowledge about what? I'm gonna get, I planted this question.
About this, he wasn't open when he filed his patent, that's the way I understood it, but it opened soon after.
So he settles here in 1890 and then does not officially apply for his homestead patent until 1902, which was puzzling to me because you only have to wait 5 years, right? So that in 1895 would have been the summer that he could have and should have applied for his homestead patent. He was not here that summer. So the family would typically leave in the winter time. One winter they went back to New York City and he worked for his cousin Gus's company. Most of the time they went down to Salt Lake City for the winter. And in fact, Catherine Winthrop Sargent was born in Salt Lake City. Of the 5 Sargent children, the oldest one, Charles Hemingway, whom they called Hemingway, was born in Connecticut. And then Mary and Martha were born in Wyoming. Catherine Winthrop was born in Salt Lake City that winter that they were, one of the winters that they were down there. And then Adelaide Jr. is born here, right here on this property. So they would always leave in the winter because winters are, I hear they're pretty harsh, right, out here. They would typically leave in November and come back in March or April because the rules of applying for a homestead patent said it's okay for you to leave, but you have to spend at least 6 months and 1 day continuously occupying the property. You have to be there for more than half of the year. And this was in the Homestead Act to try and prevent speculation from happening. And so they would go away, but not so long as to throw the possibility of filing a homestead patent into jeopardy. In 1895, they ended up leaving in July rather than November, and they don't come back until April. And he does not explain why this is the case, but I offer up a theory, and I offer some pretty good evidence for the theory. I think it was because of the rumors regarding the Bannock War of 1895, which were completely overblown. But he believed them. I think he genuinely believed that the Bannock Indians were scalping people here and killing settlers in Jackson's Hole. I mean, I know he believed them because he actually contacted Ray's father, who had a military record. And the reason the US Army finally comes in here to deal with the Bannock uprising and finds, wow, there are no dead white people. Like, in fact, the only people who died, there was a couple of Indians who died, right? The reason the military comes in here is that Schuyler Hamilton uses his connections with the military to get them to come in here. And the reason Schuyler Hamilton did that is that Jack asked him to come in. So I think Jack genuinely believed that the Bannocks were killing people. And that's why he moved his family out in July, and then he doesn't come back until the following April. Well, that's 9 months. That is long enough to put his homestead patent in jeopardy. Now, most places, the General Land Office might have been willing to turn a blind eye or make an exception, because this really was quite a hysteria. I mean, newspapers were writing about it all over the country, and I go into some of that detail. You know, so it's understandable why he might have left. But this area was being looked at as a possible place for Yellowstone National Park to expand into. And there were a lot of very powerful people in Congress and also in the US military. Philip Sheridan wanted the park expanded down into here. And Jack was kind of obsessed with that possibility. He was actually in favor of the park being expanded. I mean, again, he wants to make a business off of tourism, right? So he was in favor of having the park be expanded, but not until he had gotten his homestead claim, right? Because if he gets his homestead claim, then he can retain it, even though the park grows up around it. And so I think he was worried that if he filed his homestead patent right after he got back from being away from the Bannock War, that the General Land Office would use the fact that he had been away for 9 months as an excuse to deny him the patent. So instead, what he decided to do is he's just going to start the clock over again. And he's going to occupy this area for another 5 years. And this time he's not going to leave, ever. He's not going to run the risk of getting trapped someplace else for 9 months. He'll just live here quietly and file a patent 5 years later. The very first winter that he decides to spend here with his family, though, is a complete disaster. And then the other thing that happens is that Congress creates the Teton Timberland Reserve in 1899, 97. Anyway, it's like this is it, right? So he did end up having quite a bit of trouble when he finally did apply for his homestead patent. And it actually took an act of Congress to get it approved. So I don't know if that really answers your question. I don't think he had any insider knowledge other than just that he was, he was worried. He wanted that expansion to happen, but he was also worried it might mess up his homestead.
Well, let's see. Thank you.
Thank you.